When the Second World War came to an end in Europe, the Allied powers turned their attention towards prosecuting the political and military leaders of Nazi Germany who had been responsible for some of the war's darkest crimes. The four main Allied powers of the Soviet Union, United States, Great Britain and France held various trials to bring these leaders to justice and expose their crimes to the world. The most famous of these was the Nuremberg trials, which witnessed the sentencing of leading Nazis including Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Ernest Kaltenbrunner. But despite the degree of closure that some of these trials brought, many of the key perpetrators managed to evade justice altogether by utilising escape routes known as the Ratlines. The Ratlines were a network of Nazi sympathisers across Europe, including some rogue individuals in the Vatican, who used their influence to help these hunted war criminals from Germany and other Axis territories to escape to other parts of the world. One destination for these criminals became known above all others: Argentina. From Germany to Croatia and from Hungary to Russia, perpetrators of Axis war crimes fled to this unlikely South American haven, having been invited by the Argentine president, Juan Perón. Over time, this association between Argentina and Nazi war fugitives have become a common talking point in the memory of both World War II and its aftermath. But how much do we actually know about these Ratline runaways, and what was their fate in the decades that followed? Today we look at 8 of the most notorious figures who fled justice in war-torn Europe for a life of hiding in South America. We begin with perhaps the most famous Nazi war criminal of all, Adolf Eichmann. A dedicated Nazi and SS member from the early 1930s, Eichmann was central to the regime's progressively harsher treatment and eventual genocide of Germany's Jewish population. Rising through the Reich Security Service to become head of the department responsible for Jewish affairs, Eichmann encouraged the emigration of Jews from Germany and Austria, a policy that would later escalate into forced deportation. It was not long after this that Eichmann's office began establishing Jewish ghettos in major cities conquered during the war effort. These ghettos became known for horrendous living conditions, where disease and starvation ran rife. But the worst part was that Eichmann's crimes were only just beginning. In January 1942, he attended the Wannsee Conference in Berlin. This meeting was the final step that enshrined the genocide of Europe's Jews into official Nazi policy. Although not a leader in policy making, Eichmann nevertheless became a key perpetrator of the Holocaust by leading the organisation and scheduling of the trains that would deport Jews and other victims to various death camps. His only concern at the time appeared to be with maximising the efficiency of this process, and his actions were directly responsible for millions of deaths in the Holocaust. After the war, he managed to hide out in the German countryside for several years. Through the Ratlines, he came into contact with Alois Rudel, a Nazi-sympathising Austrian bishop based in Rome. Rudel helped Eichmann secure the necessary documents to emigrate to Argentina, and he travelled there from the Italian city of Genoa in 1950. Eichmann spent almost a decade living free in Argentina, but was always looking over his shoulder. The Nuremberg trials had exposed his crimes to the world, particularly his role in deporting Jews from Hungary in 1944. After years of gathering information and witness statements, in 1960, Israeli Mossad agents tracked him down to the city of San Fernando, just outside the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires. He was swiftly captured and smuggled on a flight back to Jerusalem, where he would finally face trial. At his trial, Eichmann was confronted with the realities of the Holocaust and his role in it, facts that he was simply unable to deny. His only defence tactic was to try and avoid as much personal responsibility as possible by claiming that he had only been following orders from his superiors. This defence did little to help him, and in December 1961 he was found guilty on 15 separate counts and sentenced to death. He was hanged on June 1, 1962, achieving a small but significant measure of justice for the millions of people whose lives he destroyed. His trial, and in particular his defence, continued to be the subject of interest right up to the present day. Not all of those who fled via the Ratlines were subject to an intense manhunt like Eichmann was, and several were able to live their lives in relative obscurity. The SS and police leader, Ludolf Von Alvensleben, was one such case. Von Alvensleben had sat in the Reichstag parliament as a representative of the Nazi Party, steadily rising through the ranks until 1939, where he became commander of the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz in the newly conquered Polish territory of Danzig, West Prussia. This paramilitary group was formed from the ethnic German minority minority in Poland and committed mass executions of the ethnic Poles after the German invasion. Among the most brutal of these were the Valley of Death at Fordon and the massacres in Piaśnica, which together resulted in the murder of as many as 15,000 Poles. Von Alvensleben told his men, "You are now the master race here. Don't be soft, be merciless, and clear out everything that is not German and could hinder us in the work of construction." He later transferred to Ukraine, where he oversaw forced labour projects and further mass executions, before eventually fleeing westwards as the war turned in the Allies' favour. Like many others who fled to Argentina, von Alvensleben was actually captured at the war's end, but managed to escape and hid in a village in central Germany. Via the Ratlines, he escaped to Argentina in 1946, living first in the capital Buenos Aires and in a small village near Cordoba. It looked for a while like his crimes may be forgotten, but fortunately this wasn't the case. In 1964, the District Court of Munich put out an arrest warrant for von Alvensleben for his role in the murder of 4,000 ethnic Poles in West Prussia. But despite repeated efforts to locate him, von Alvensleben remained invisible in rural Argentina and died in 1970, having never been brought to justice. The story of Sandor Kepiro is one that reminds us just how recently some of these events unfolded and how long the wait for justice can sometimes be. A police officer in the gendarmerie of Nazi-allied Hungary, in 1942 Kepiro took part in a raid into the Serbian city of Novi Sad. Over 1,200 Serbs and Jews were murdered, and Kepiro himself is believed to have ordered the execution of around 30 to 40 of these victims. In 1944, he was convicted of this crime and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but Hungary's fascist government released him almost immediately and he fled to Argentina. This conviction would one day play a key part in his story, but more on that later. With a communist government in charge of Hungary after the war, Kepiro kept his distance from his homeland, remaining in Argentina for over 50 years. When the communist regime collapsed, he quietly returned to Hungary in 1996, his true identity seemingly going unnoticed. After another 10 years came and went, in 2006 the Simon Wiesenthal Center identified Kepiro and accused him of war crimes. The 1944 trial was the main piece of evidence against him, and a second investigation spearheaded by a man named Efraim Zurov eventually led to Kepiro being charged with war crimes in February 2011. In court, Kepiro acknowledged that he had taken part in the raid in Novi Sad, but denied having any role in the killings, claiming that he was being targeted purely because he was the last survivor from this event. That July he was found not guilty, much to the outrage of the Wiesenthal Center and the people of Novi Sad. The trial had put an additional strain on the elderly Kepiro's health, and just weeks afterwards, on September the 3rd, he died at the age of 97. At the time of his death, he was top of the Wiesenthal Center's list of most wanted Nazis. Of all Hitler's allies throughout the puppet regimes of Nazi-occupied Europe, very few matched the brutality and bloodthirst of the Croatian leader Ante Pavelic. After Nazi Germany invaded and dissolved Yugoslavia in 1941, this butcher of the Balkans established and became the leader of a new country carved out of its remains. This country was called the Independent State of Croatia, also known as the NDH. The NDH was ruled by Pavelic's ultra-nationalist and terrorist organisation commonly known as the Ustasha, a group whose ideology and style so closely resembled the Nazis that Pavelic even gave himself the title of Poglavnik, a Croatian equivalent to Führer. Under Pavelic's command, the NDH murdered over 3/4 of its 40,000 Jews as part of the Holocaust, but an even bigger target for the regime was the state's large minority of ethnic Serbs. Estimates put the number of murdered Serbs in the NDH at least 200,000, some being considerably higher. Hundreds of thousands more were either deported or forced to convert to Catholicism. Pavelic's regime independently operated several concentration camps. The most well-known of these was Jasenovac, a place of horrifying brutality that served as the largest World War II death camp not operated by Nazi Germany. The Ustasha's eventual defeat by the communist Yugoslav partisans saw the NDH collapse and Pavelic fled to Italy. Similar to Eichmann, he found shelter among rogue elements of the Vatican and was given documents with the false name of Pablo Araños, which helped cover him so that he could flee to Argentina. After arriving in 1948, he sought to continue his fascist activities in exile, seeking to undermine undermine the re-established Yugoslavia, but it was only a matter of time before his crimes would catch up with him. In April 1957, Pavelic joined other Croatian emigres in an anniversary celebration of the founding of the NDH. Whilst on his way back home that night, Pavelic was shot repeatedly by Blagoje Jovovic, a Montenegrin who was seeking revenge for the Serbian genocide. The assassination attempt was unsuccessful, but the incident revealed his identity, and he immediately fled to Chile with his wounds untreated. Pavelic eventually found refuge in Franco's Spain, where he died from his wounds in 1959. Today he is buried in a cemetery in Madrid, having never faced justice for his appalling crimes. Next we move on to someone who actually wasn't a war criminal at all, but who spent his time in Argentina doing all that he could to assist some of his more notorious counterparts. His name was Hans Ulrich Rudel, and he served in the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, during the war. Over the course of his wartime career, he completed over 2,500 missions on the Eastern Front, destroying over 800 Soviet military vehicles. As a result of his service and his exceptional flying skills, he soon became the most decorated pilot in the entirety of the Luftwaffe. Arrested by American forces at the war's end in May 1945, he was not accused of any war crime and was soon released, before utilising the Ratlines to travel to Argentina in 1948. Rudel was very politically active in Argentina, founding a relief organisation for Nazi fugitives and sheltering the monstrous SS doctor Josef Mengele, who we will cover next. Soon after Argentine leader Juan Perón fell from power in 1955, Rudel moved on to Brazil and later Paraguay, befriending the Paraguayan dictator Alfredo Stroessner and continuing to assist Nazi fugitives. Whilst in South America, he published his autobiography, revealing his still deeply entrenched Nazi views and burning hatred of the Soviet Union. He eventually returned to West Germany, where he continued to support far-right movements that yearned for the revival of Nazism. In 1982, he suffered a stroke and died in Bavaria at the age of 66. Today, he is probably more remembered for his aviation career than his crusade for the post-war revival of Nazism. Of all the twisted and evil figures responsible for the Nazi regime's sickening crimes against humanity, few names invoke as much revulsion as that of Josef Mengele. A young doctor who became a committed Nazi during the 1930s, Mengele's wartime career began as a soldier and medic, firstly in Poland and later on the Eastern Front. His days at the front were over after he was wounded in 1942, but the horrors that would define his twisted legacy were yet to even begin. In mid-1943, Mengele was posted to Birkenau, the largest concentration camp within the Auschwitz complex. He joined as a physician at Birkenau's Romani family camp, where he immediately became involved in Auschwitz's infamous selections, sending prisoners deemed unsuitable for work straight to the gas chambers. Those who weren't immediately murdered faced the equally horrifying prospect of being a test subject for Mengele's sadistic experiments. These were sickeningly sadistic procedures, including sterilisation, amputations, organ removals, injection of poison and other chemicals, and the exposure to deadly diseases. Many of his victims were children, and he had a particular fascination with twins. Thousands of them were murdered in these gruesome experiments. With the Soviet army advancing, Mengele fled Auschwitz in January 1945, just days before its liberation. He moved westward as the war came to an end, and spent a few years hiding in the German countryside, before using the Ratlines to escape to Genoa and then Argentina in 1949. Mengele initially flew under the radar in Argentina, even though in 1956 he took a holiday in Europe with a passport registered under his real name that had been granted by the West German embassy. By the late 1950s, Nazi hunters had learned of Mengele's residence in Buenos Aires and resolved to capture him. In 1960, the Israeli Mossad seemed to be on the brink of finding him during the same operation that captured Adolf Eichmann. But just before this, Mengele had fled to Paraguay and the search was abandoned. He soon moved on to Brazil, and the efforts to capture him continued to be fruitless. In 1979, he suffered a stroke and drowned off the coast of Bertioga near Sao Paulo, Brazil, at the age of 67. He never faced trial or expressed any remorse for his crimes, and to this day, his name remains synonymous with the darkest horrors that were perpetrated at Auschwitz. In this video so far, we've covered notorious figures from Nazi Germany and their Axis allies Croatia and Hungary, but what you probably wouldn't expect to see is someone from Germany's sworn enemy, Russia. A few anti-communist Russians did actually fight on behalf of Germany, and a man named Boris Smyslovsky was among the most prominent. Smyslovsky was part of a generation of Russians who fled after the White Army had been defeated in the Russian Civil War, a group who came to be known as the White Russian Emigres. The White Army represented the old Russian Empire, fighting against the Communist Red Army who would eventually win and lead to the creation of the Soviet Union. Defeated White Russians like Smyslovsky spent the 1920s and 30s opposing this new state from exile. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Smyslovsky supported the campaign and led a group of thousands of volunteers titled the Special Division Russia. In doing so, he became the first Russian to lead a fighting unit under German command. In 1945, with the Axis close to defeat, this unit was upgraded and given the title of First Russian National Army, but this meant very little, and these Russian soldiers eventually resorted to hiding in Western Austria. At the war's end, Smyslovsky and the surviving soldiers crossed the border into the tiny country of Liechtenstein, the only European nation who did not forcibly repatriate Axis-fighting Russians back to their homeland. In a country of just over 12,000 people, these 400 soldiers made up over 3% of the entire population. Liechtenstein did its utmost to support them, until eventually Argentina offered asylum, an offer taken by Smyslovsky and around 100 remaining soldiers. Smyslovsky's exile in Argentina lasted for over 25 years before he eventually decided to return and live out the rest of his days in Liechtenstein. In his latter years, he continued to oppose the Soviet regime from his base in the Alps, but always denied any suggestion that he was a Nazi. He died in 1988 at the age of 90. Today there is a monument in northern Liechtenstein memorializing this group of runaway Russian soldiers. And last but not least, we covered a man once called the most notorious living Nazi war criminal not in custody, a bloodthirsty figure who successfully hid for over 50 years before accidentally talking himself into a prison sentence. This was the Croatian Dinko Sakic. Like the Hungarian Sandor Kepiro, Sakic's story drifted well into the new century. But unlike some of the other notorious figures on this list, the depravity and scale of Sakic's crimes did not spark a large movement to bring him to justice. A die-hard supporter of the Ustasha from his youth, in 1941 the young Sakic joined the staff of Jasenovats, which as you may recall from earlier was one of Europe's largest concentration camps. Sakic was involved as 100,000 people were murdered throughout the camp's operation. And in 1944, through his support for the regime and his marriage to the sister of a senior Ustasha named Max Ludolf, he became the camp's commander. At this time Sakic was just 22 years old, making him one of the youngest concentration camp leaders in Axis-ruled Europe. The daily horrors of Jasenovats did not relent during Sakic's 7-month leadership. Prisoners continued to be murdered in their thousands, many of them dying by the hand of Sakic himself. When the NDH collapsed, Sakic and his wife hid in Spain before emigrating to Argentina in 1947. Whilst there, he made absolutely no attempt to hide his identity and remained active in the Croatian emigre community. For 50 years he lived undisturbed, and it seemed that post-war Nazi hunters had even forgotten about him. But amazingly, it would end up being Sakic himself who would sow the seeds of his own downfall. During the 1990s, he gave an interview regarding Jasenovats, confidently exclaiming that he would do it all again and that he slept like a baby over how he ran the camp. He even met briefly with Croatian President Franjo Tudjman, straying ever closer to worldwide exposure. Another interview that he gave on Argentine television in 1998 was the final straw, and Argentine citizens demanded his arrest. He was extradited back to his native Croatia shortly afterwards and put on trial. Several Jasenovat survivors testified against him, and in October 1998 he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Prison was where he would die in 2008 at the age of 86. His twisted story finally coming to an end. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.